talk about export subsidies today, work our way through that analysis. There is a set of readings on political economy effects. I'm going to talk around the edges of that when we talk about subsidies today. There's a little bit more detailed analysis in the readings. It's not going to be absolutely necessary for you to be able to duplicate that. I just want to get the gist across of what political economy issues there are when it comes to the formation of trade policy. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today. We're then going to turn our attention in the second half of the course today to begin to introduce the issue of market imperfections and policies that can be used to maybe increase welfare even for small importing countries. And we're going to do two examples of that. We're going to do one where there might be unemployment that prevails in a marketplace as a result of a surge of imports that comes in from abroad. We're going to do a second example, which is a very well-known example of beneficial protectionism that's known as the infant industry argument. It's something you may have heard about before. And we're going to look at it in a little bit more detail using the economic model that we've been working with to analyze policies. So we'll get through all of that between this week and next week, so we better get going. Now, we've walked our way through the effects of one sort of trade policy, namely a tariff. But we've looked at that tariff in two different contexts, small country case and a large country case. Small countries, remember, cannot have any impact or effect upon what happens in the rest of the world because they're presumed to be too small. Their imports and or exports, if it's on the export side, is not large enough to influence or affect what's happening in the world markets. So they have to take the prices given and they react accordingly. The small country puts a tariff into place, it affects itself, but it does not affect the rest of the world in any meaningful or noticeable way. That's the assumption of smallness. Large countries, however, are big enough, import enough, or export enough to have an influence upon the international price. It affects what happens in the world, and thus a domestic policy at the border can indeed influence the outcomes for firms and consumers and even governments in the rest of the world. And we looked at that in the case of tariffs before. We were able to show that for a small country implementing any sort of a tariff whatsoever, it's actually going to make the country worse off in an aggregate sense. Consumers will lose from protection. Firms will benefit in the import competing industries. The government will collect some revenue, but the net effect of increasing tariffs for small countries is to reduce overall welfare for the country. Tariffs are bad. The optimal policy in a small country case is a zero tariff. Large countries, it's different though. If you're a large country, there's actually a favorable tariff, a positive tariff that can actually raise national welfare and improve the well-being of a country that's implementing it, at the expense, though, of the rest of the world and the other countries in the rest of the world. So you can understand, perhaps, why other countries would be miffed if countries decided to use protectionism and had negative effects upon them in that particular way. Now, today we're going to turn our attention to an export subsidy. And export subsidies are something that are indeed used by many countries to promote exports. And often it's done in agricultural commodities. It's worth noting, and I'm going to come back to this point in a little bit, that countries that are members of the WTO, which consists of almost all countries in the world today, are not allowed, in essence, to implement export subsidies on non-agricultural goods. Or at least if you do, you might have the reaction of an anti-subsidy action taken against you. And there are rules written into the WTO agreement that allow countries to, quote-unquote, protect themselves when countries use export subsidies against them. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at and analyze the impact of export subsidies in large country cases and see, A, why countries might impose them in the first place, B, what the impact is abroad and why they are looked upon so negatively, and why there has been push by lots of other countries, especially non-US, non-European countries, to try to eliminate the export subsidies that large countries like the US have used from time to time. And again, these subsidies are allowable still, even under the WTO, in agricultural commodities. So we, as an example, in the US, use export subsidies quite regularly in areas like cotton exports. We will subsidize exports of cotton, and we're going to see how that can help our cotton industry domestically. And we will, from time to time, also subsidize the exports of other agricultural commodities. It's been a long-time program that's been in place since the Great Depression years, and it's something that we do, other countries have done, and so it's a well-known or at least an occasionally used trade policy by countries. Now let's go to the board. Okay, so I'm going to use the graphs from the notes instead of drawing them freehand. And we're going to take a look at the welfare effects in a large country case. First, we're going to talk about the price and quantity effects in a large country case. So we're going to use this particular diagram. I'm going to blow this up in just a minute, so we'll get a better view of it. But I want to highlight the fact that we're going to talk about two countries in a two-country world coming together. One country is an exporter in free trade. That's the right country, the exporting country. The other country is the importing country in free trade. We're going to imagine that what one country exports, the other has to import, and that there is a free trade price that will equalize or balance trade between the two in that particular commodity or product. So go over here, and here's a blown-up version of the same thing. And what we've got here, let's imagine that the U.S. is the exporting country for this point. And let's imagine the importing country is, I don't know, Mexico. And let's imagine that the product in question is an agricultural good, such as corn. So we might decide to supply or pay farmers, agricultural producers in the country, a certain amount of money per unit that they decide to export to the rest of the world. And one of the reasons for that is often to try to offset some of the negative effects of our own domestic agricultural policies. So for example, just to give you a little bit of background, sometimes we implement price support programs for certain agricultural commodities or goods. That prevents the price from falling to too low of a level and thus injuring or hurting farmers by having them obtain a much lower than normal income during a particular surge of production of a particular commodity. Now, by keeping the price up and mandating that a price floor or price support is going to be in place, the government has to enter that market and buy up any of the excess supplied commodity that comes about. And the government then has to store that. If they run this price support for a period of time and the prices are just abnormally low or unusually low, and year after year the government has to buy up surplus commodity to make the program work, well, what happens sometimes is governments will decide, hey, we got to get rid of this stuff. We can't store it forever. So where can we sell it without affecting the price domestically? The answer becomes, hey, what about an export subsidy? We can subsidize our producers, have them ship it abroad instead. That way we don't have to buy it up as a government to keep the prices high. And as we're going to see, it's going to have the effect of raising up the domestic price and supporting farmers in a similar way to a price support program that's implemented domestically. All right, so let's go to the diagram. Exporting country, U.S. Demand curve here, supply curve here. The intersection is drawn way down low on the graph. That would be the autarky price that would prevail if the country were closed off to trade. Importing country, Mexico. Supply and demand curve represented. The intersection here, too, represents the autarky price that would prevail in Mexico if no trade took place. If the two countries were to open up to free trade with each other, then the low price in the U.S. and the high price in Mexico would induce suppliers of the product in the U.S. to want to move their product to the higher priced market in Mexico. Shifting supply to Mexico, by virtue of that, the price in Mexico will come down, the price in the U.S. will go up, and the price that is finally achieved in free trade has to be that price in a two-country world that equalizes U.S. exports with Mexican imports. Now that price is listed here as PFT. The level of U.S. exports is going to be given by the difference between the supply here and the demand here. So this horizontal distance given by that, I think it's a blue line, right? By the blue line is going to be U.S. exports at PFT. That should be exactly equal to the distance between Mexican demand here at this point minus Mexican supply here at this point, also at the same price level, price PFT. And so U.S. exports will be equal to Mexican imports at the price PFT. That will be the starting point for the analysis. All right, now we're in free trade. U.S. decides it's going to implement a subsidy on exports from the U.S., the exporting country, to the importing country. The subsidy will be a per unit payment for each unit that gets exported, not to everything that's produced, just the units that are exported are going to get a payment. So it's kind of like, imagine you're putting corn onto a truck, and it's going across the border into Mexico, and customs are going to look at that and say, oh, how much corn have you got? What's the weight? How many bushels or whatever? We're going to weigh it, and then you're going to get a check from the government a little bit later because you have exported this product to Mexico, and that's how the subsidy program would work. Now, as you might imagine, if you pay somebody to do something, they're quite likely to do more of it. And that's exactly what we'd expect to see happen. So even though the U.S. is already exporting the product here, an export subsidy, paying people to do it, is certainly going to encourage them to do even more. So what we'd expect to happen is the following. U.S. producers will start to export more to the Mexican market. That is going to increase the supply of corn in Mexico, thereby pushing the price in Mexico downward. In the U.S., there will be less supply, less available supply, because more farmers will be induced by the payment from the government to ship some of their corn to Mexico instead. So lower supply in the U.S. is going to force the price in the U.S. upward. Price in Mexico gets pushed down, price in the U.S. gets pushed up, right? Now, when we get to a new equilibrium, two conditions have to prevail. Number one, the price in the U.S. after the subsidy is imposed, I call it PUSS right here, has got to be equal to the price in Mexico after the subsidy is imposed by the U.S., I'm calling that PMEX sub S, plus the value of the subsidy per unit. So the Mexican price is lower, the U.S. price is higher, and the difference between the two is the value of the subsidy that's being provided. Now, a higher price in the U.S. is going to induce the U.S. to want to export more, because a higher price in the U.S. is going to discourage demand, moving along the demand curve, and it's going to encourage more supply of the product. So more will be produced in subsequent months and years because the subsidy is being provided. So that's going to expand the amount that the U.S. wishes to export if they can indeed get this higher price for the commodity. In contrast, in Mexico, the price is going to get pushed downward. And as a result of that lower price, demand will go up because of the lower price, and supply will go down because of the lower price in Mexico, encouraging Mexico thereby to increase their imports from abroad, abroad being the United States. Now, the condition that has to prevail ultimately is that the amount that the U.S. exports at the new higher price that prevails in the U.S., whatever that turns out to be, has got to be equal to the amount that Mexico imports. Import demand is what MD stands for. The amount that Mexico imports at the new lower price that prevails in Mexico. All right, so those are the conditions that would be satisfied in a perfectly competitive market when the exporting country's government implements an export subsidy of S dollars per unit. Back to the graph. The effect then, in terms of prices, have already been explained. U.S. price goes up because of the subsidy, Mexican price gets pushed downward. The other effect is that exports and imports are expanded. So more trade will occur as a result of the export subsidy being provided. Again, if you encourage activity, you get more of that activity, and so we'd expect to see more exports as we do. So that's what happens in the market. Now, the next question we're going to ask is, well, what happens to the participants in the market as a result of the subsidy policy being imposed? Let's start with the exporting country, the setting country. U.S. is putting the export subsidy into place, and we're going to ask, well, first of all, how about domestic U.S. consumers, those who are demanding the product at home? Are they made better off or worse off as a result of U.S.'s subsidy policy? Worse off. Worse off because they have to pay a higher price, right? Okay, how about producers at home? Domestic producers of corn who get the subsidy, are they better off or worse off as a result of the subsidy? Better off. They get a higher price, they expand their production, they hire more workers, it's good for the industry. Third effect, though, is going to be the subsidy payments that have to be made by the government to support this particular program. And where does that money come from? Taxpayers. The government has to collect that money from somebody else at some other time in some other place in order to make the payments in the program possible. And we're going to represent those payments by multiplying the subsidy payment or rate per unit times the amount of trade that actually takes place, the amount of exports that occur. And that's going to give us the subsidy payments. So let's walk our way through that. We're starting with the exporting country. Change in consumer surplus, welfare effects of the export subsidy. So the original price is here at PFT. The demand curve is given here. The price in the US rises up to PUSS. And the change in consumer surplus is going to be given by the loss of area A and B. So consumer surplus goes down, and we can measure it in dollar terms by measuring the change in surplus. So we mark it off here as a negative A plus B in parentheses. Second, producer surplus. Production is increased from this level, right along the horizontal axis, up to this level. And that's going to inspire an expansion of production and an increase in profitability to the firms in the industry. We measure that profit with producer surplus, and producer surplus is going to go up by area A plus B plus C, the area between the original price, PFT, the new price, PEXS, and the supply curve is going to give us the change in surplus. So, plus A plus B plus C is the value of the increase in surplus that goes to producers. Third, the payments that have to be made by the government. Now, the difference in the prices, not between the free trade price and the new US price, but between the new US price and the Mexican price, that full distance right there is going to be the value of the subsidy. That's the first condition that we said has to be satisfied in the new equilibrium. So the subsidy splits the prices in the two countries apart by the amount of the subsidy. That's that vertical distance. The amount of trade in the country is given by the distance of the red line measured along the horizontal axis. That is SS minus DS. So the amount of payments and the money that has to be collected from taxpayers is going to be given by area B plus C plus D plus F plus G plus H. That's the total value of the subsidy payment. So let's include that over here. B, C, D, F, G, H. It's a negative effect because it's coming out of taxpayers' pockets. All right, that's it. End of story. Those are the sum total effects that are going to accrue to different groups in the U.S. economy. We can now do what economists like to do, add them all up, and see what the net effect is by putting the subsidy policy into place. And what we get is the A's and B's, you'll see, cancel out on the first two lines, both A and B. The C is positive in the second line, but negative in the third line, so that C is going to cancel out. And we're going to be left with the net effect being negative B, D, F, G, H. Negative. Go back to this. B, F, G, H, and D is what the outcome is. It kind of looks like this crown. And we would actually break that down into two kind of sub-effects. There are deadweight losses given by little area B and D, the triangles there. Those are losses in efficiency that result because of the subsidy. And then F, G, and H is something we would call a terms of trade loss, because there's a loss of money because of the extra payments that have to be made and the fact that we're not getting as high a price from the sales of the product to Mexico. And there's a loss that's accruing FGH as a result of that. But what's interesting about this is that subsidies are very, very common and very prominent in many countries and in many situations in our history. And the economic analysis suggests that they're a net loser for the country, that it's actually causing losses to the economy. All right, so that should give us some pause and maybe ask us to make us wonder, well, why are these policies being used if it has a net negative effect upon the economy? All right, let's hold on to that question for a second and move on to the next issue, which is what are the effects that are occurring to the other country? So the importing countries generally respond negatively to any use of export subsidies by foreign countries. And they usually disparage them and say the country should stop doing that. So let's take a look at the importing country and ask, well, what happens welfare-wise to them because of the U.S. use of the subsidy? Okay, now here, the price is moving from PFT down to PSIN. The lower price is now prevailing in the importing country. So we ask, what happens to consumers in that country because of the US subsidy? Better or worse off?
Better.
They're better off, they get a lower price, they expand their consumption from this level here, right along the horizontal axis, out to this level here. What is the value of the increase in consumer surplus as a result of the US subsidy policy then, read from the graph? Positive, E, F, and G. Right there. Plus E, F, and G is the change in consumer surplus as a result of the lower price that now prevails in Mexico. Okay, what about producers? Better or worse off in Mexico as a result of the US subsidy policy? They are worse off, they get a lower price, they have to cut back their production, they might have to fire some workers, so workers are laid off as a result of this. Doesn't look good in the industry because of the US subsidy policy. What is the loss in profitability to the firms as measured on this diagram? E and F. Okay, that's the change in production, producer surplus, as a result of the US policy. Now there's no change in government revenue. Government isn't doing anything in Mexico. And so the total change in welfare for the importing country is the summation of the effects on consumers and producers. Now, quite interestingly, the E's and F will both cancel out, and we're going to be left with the national welfare effect in Mexico, the importing country, turns out to be a nice big positive effect. In other words, when foreign countries subsidize their exports, the net effect on other countries, if they're affected at all, and they only will be if it's a large country doing it, the net effect on the importing country is always going to be positive. Now, it becomes interesting to take note of the fact that most countries who receive the imports from abroad at cheaper prices complain about it. And they say, hey, this has got to stop. This is unfair. It's unfair that foreign governments are subsidizing the exports of a product and it's hurting us in this country. Well, saying hurting us in this country is a little bit too strong. What it does do is it hurts a particular segment of the economy. And in particular, it hurts the import competing firms. Those firms are indeed injured as a result of the foreign subsidies. And when we say it's unfair for foreign governments to subsidize, we're not really talking about fairness to the consumers in Mexico here in this example. Because the consumers would be like, whoa, wait a minute, what's unfair about us having to pay lower prices and allowing us to consume more of the product? That's not unfair. So it's not unfair to everybody within the country. It's only deemed unfair to one group, and that is the producing group, or the producers within the importing country. Now, this could lead us to a conclusion that maybe governments are not really inclined to do what's best in the national interest. They're not really motivated to maximize the national welfare like we're trying to evaluate in economics. Instead, they seem to be motivated by something else. And we can learn a little bit more about that by noting that, for example, there is an anti-subsidy law in the books that's been written into the WTO Accord, and it was a part of the GATT agreement way back in the 1940s. What the anti-subsidy, one of the trade remedy laws that we talked about quite a few classes ago now, what that anti-subsidy law does, it allows a country like Mexico, and I'm going to kind of put this in economic jargon, and it's going to sound silly. It allows a country like Mexico to protect itself from the benefits that are being foisted upon it by the subsidizing country abroad. And it allows them to retaliate against those benefits and hurt themselves. That's what an anti-subsidy law does, in effect. Now, stated that way, why on earth would we put a law like that into place? Well, the answer must be, in part, the government is not concerned about the national welfare when it thinks about putting a law like this into place. Instead, it must be concerned about something else. And the prime candidate for that would tend to be the welfare that accrues to the import-competing firms. They, in fact, are the ones who have loud voices in legislatures in the US and in other countries around the world, and they're the ones who argue for support of policies like this. They're the ones who are out there saying, it's unfair when foreign countries are subsidizing because it's hurting our industries, it's hurting jobs, and they'll go one step further and say it's hurting our economy. It's bad for us and it's good for them and we've got to stop it. not quite true, though, that it's bad for the economy. It's bad for some groups in the economy, but not for others. And our evaluation of it in use of economic models would suggest that the benefits that accrue to the winners, the consumers in particular, are going to likely vastly outweigh, or at least outweigh, the losses that are going to accrue to the producers. You know, it's kind of like the following. If foreign governments are willing to subsidize the export of a particular product, then what you're able to do as an importing country is to enjoy lower prices for goods that are being financed completely by taxpayers in the rest of the world. So you're able to enjoy lower prices for goods all because the foreign government was silly enough, if you will, to try to subsidize the export and help their industries. But in helping their industries, they're hurting their taxpayers and they're hurting their consumers to boot. So the country that subsidizes exports is being hurt twofold. Taxpayers have to pay more, consumers have to pay more in the exporting country, but the beneficiaries are the exporting industries. And they're the ones we hear a lot about. Now, political economy issues. The gist about political economy is a simple one to understand, and it's important because it helps us to understand the motivation for a lot of policies and sometimes the nonsensical policies that are out there. One of the reasons why export subsidies came about is because of some tragic circumstances from time to time in industries like in farming industries or agricultural industries from time to time. So there was a response to try to protect farmers, protect the incomes of farmers, to keep prices high, and that led eventually to the evolution of export subsidy policies like we've got. We'll subsidize exports of our agricultural goods from time to time. We look at it then from the vantage point of the industry. It's good for the industry to subsidize exports, and it's good for our industry to rally against foreign subsidies on exports because it's going to hurt our particular firms. Now, the losers from export subsidies are consumers in the domestic economy and the taxpayers. But there's an important characteristic about the losses and benefits that accrue to different groups. When an export subsidy is put into place, and we look at these effects over here, so the exporting country puts an export subsidy in place. It's going to benefit the producers and it's going to hurt consumers and taxpayers. If we think about the size of the losses that are going to accrue, the losses to consumers are likely to come about in very small increments when we look at it per unit of the product that's being consumed, and if we look at it, say, per household. And that's because the consumers of a product like corn in the United States probably makes up almost the entire population. Or at least 80% of the population consumes corn during the year, I'm sure. Maybe even 100%. So what happens with an export subsidy is domestic prices get pushed up, but not by that much. And as a result, people will pay more for corn, but it's not going to be a noticeable effect probably. So you put an export subsidy on a product like corn, prices might go up by 10 cents or 20 cents for your typical meal, cornmeal meal, I don't know. It's going to go up by a small amount, so small that it's unlikely to be noticed by most consumers. The out-of-pocket extra expenses that consumers have to pay are likely to be relatively small, and even when we add it up across an entire year per family, we might be talking about a couple of extra dollars at most. But when we take those couple of extra dollars per household and spread it out across all of the households in America, it's going to sum up to a large number. And it's that large number that's being lost by lots and lots of people in a very small way because of the export subsidy policy. Now, because of the dispersion of the costs, and before I say that, let me look at taxpayers for a second, because there too, there's an expense that's being borne by the government. They have to collect more money from taxpayers, but who's paying that really? Nobody really would notice, a $5 billion subsidy program for agricultural goods, because $5 billion in a budget of $2.5 trillion in the U.S. government is going to be not noticeable. And no taxpayer is going to know that their taxes somewhere now or in the future are being affected in a positive or increased way because of a $5 billion subsidy program to farmers. So the costs to taxpayers are dispersed across hundreds of millions of taxpayers, or at least millions of households, that are going to have to pay a little bit more somewhere in order to finance this particular policy. The costs are dispersed, spread out widely, very small per person effects. But the benefits are going to go to producers in the corn industry. And in that industry, there's going to be a much smaller grouping of people. There's going to be a couple of thousand or tens of thousands of workers that work in that particular industry. And the benefits that they're going to get are going to be noticed by especially the large firms that operate in that particular sector. So they're going to get not a couple of extra cents, they're going to get a couple of extra tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars that will flow their way because of a small payment made by the government to subsidize or to encourage exports. So benefits to the firms are concentrated in their hands, while the costs of the program are dispersed largely across consumers and taxpayers, so much so that they won't even notice the effects of that policy. Now, that's one reason why firms often get their way and get policies implemented that maximize or at least encourage producer surplus benefits, production effects, rather than what the overall effect would be in the economy itself. And it's also why importing countries tend to complain about foreign export subsidies. Economists usually say that what we ought to do when foreigners subsidize exports is we ought to just send a thank you note and say, keep letting your taxpayers fund lower prices for us. That's great. But we never do that. Instead, we put up rules like trade remedy laws that allow us to protect ourselves from the foreign subsidy. But who are we really protecting? We're really protecting the import-competing industries who have a lot to lose when foreign governments subsidize exports. We're not protecting, in those actions, the consumers at home who are able to enjoy the lower prices that are coming about because of these subsidized products. Now, to make a case in point, China is an example of a country that has been subsidizing production for about the last 5 or 6 years in a big way. And they've done that by providing low interest loans or favorable loans to state-owned enterprises and industries. And they have fueled an expansion of production that has allowed their economy to grow at a fairly rapid clip in the post-financial crisis era, since 2008 or so. As a result of that encouragement of production, they don't want unemployment, they don't want the economy to collapse, so they have been stimulating additional production of lots and lots of things. As a result, China has ended up building up stockpiles of products that cannot be sold because there is no demand for them, for those products. And one place where that's occurred in a big way is steel. Now, steel production in China has continued to grow rapidly despite the fact that nobody has been buying it. But now China is stuck with all of this steel that's been produced, and they would like to get rid of it. So what have they done? They've started exporting it at very low prices to international markets. The US has responded to that, as has Europe, by putting into place trade remedy actions. We've charged China with dumping their products and subsidizing their products for export to the US market. We've used our WTO legal remedies and responded by increasing tariffs against China for these particular products to 500%. We have 500% tariffs on China's certain types of steel coming in from China now. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Trump might encourage more of. It is possible to take action against a lot of other countries who might be seen as subsidizing or encouraging exports at low prices, and we could use trade remedy laws as a mechanism to raise up levels of protection and to keep out those imports from abroad. Now, will that help the country? Economic analysis would suggest that in competitive markets, the answer is no. It will help certain groups within the country, yes. It will help promote jobs in, like, the steel sector and in certain other sectors where the tariffs are applied. But it will also raise the prices of these commodities much above the level that would otherwise obtain, and will hurt consumers, will hurt firms that use products as an intermediate source that's used in their production process, and it will hurt the overall well-being of the economy because fewer products will come in, at higher prices will prevail, and less overall output will be achievable by even the US economy. So the economic argument is that this kind of reaction, this protection, doesn't help us overall. It helps some groups, but at the much larger expense of other groups. And that's the problem associated with protection. It's also quite clear that in terms of the mechanics of the political economy issue, that it's the industries themselves and their workers that have the largest amount of clout, or I should say are heard, their voices are heard the loudest in legislatures like in the United States. So when recessions occur, when economic downturns start to occur, or when we get a surge of imports that come in from abroad, like we've seen with steel from China and like with some other products, it is the industries that quickly pipe up and say, we've got to do something about this. Now, they will never say, we've got to do something about this because we're losing profits and we need to make more money for our shareholders. What they will say is, we've got to do this for the people, and in particular for their jobs. We've got to save jobs. And they're absolutely right that they could save jobs in their industry by putting these policies into place. So they're not lying about that. But what's being missed is the larger picture, kind of what's happening overall in the market, and that's the story that doesn't get told as well. Consumer voices are quiet when it comes to issues like trade, and taxpayer voices when it comes to subsidies are often quiet, and that allows industries to get their way more often than not. Now, sometimes it doesn't happen that way. And one of the great successes of, if you will, promotion of competition and the consumer and national interest being heard has really been the push towards trade liberalization that's occurred in the post-World War II era. So, if anything, the political economy aspects of concentrated benefits in the hands of industry and dispersed losses to consumers, that applies to an awful lot of policies. And if that won the day always, we would have high levels of protection that would carry the day, and that would be our general policies, because industries would always win. But industries haven't always won in the past. And trade liberalization has been one of those long pushes, drives, to try to accomplish an improvement in economic efficiency and well-being for the general good, but at the difficulty of great resistance every step of the way by industries who are negatively affected each time we move towards freer trade. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership is another example of a push towards freer trade. I can complain about some of the details. We could argue a little bit about maybe it's incorporating more monopoly privileges for certain firms, and it's giving maybe less competition in some markets than would be appropriate. But it is also driving countries to lower their barriers to trade on many items and pushing for trade liberalization, which should have the effect of having positive impacts for consumers at the expense of adjustment costs that will be borne by industries as we adjust the trade patterns internationally in response to that. Now there's beginning to be a backlash against that sort of 50-plus year push towards trade liberalization. And it could be very easy for us to slip back and to sort of begin to listen to the sounds of industry and worker groups saying we need to do this for our country, but we should be wary about, and at least aware of, the larger effects that we might be seeing as a result of increased protectionist actions today. Any thoughts, questions? Yeah.
Is that pushback just part of a cycle? Like, do you see this being a new trend, or is it just, will it eventually swing back the other way? Is it long-term?
We've seen a lot of cycles over the last several centuries or so, and there have been periods of time where trade liberalization has kind of won out, and we've reduced barriers to trade, and that's been followed by periods of time, like back in the 1930s, where levels of protection rose up quite dramatically. We've had ups and downs even in the post-World War period, where there's been sort of a retrenching of protectionist interests and an increase in protection that's occurred in certain sectors or industries that's been very difficult to eliminate. The quota system on textiles and apparel products that began in the 1970s and extended through to 2005 was one of those sort of steps back in the direction of protectionism, while at the same time we were liberalizing trade in other areas. So we've kind of had pressures in both directions, but it's been very hard to kind of maintain the momentum towards trade liberalization, because there are sort of constant pressures that come to bear on politicians who hear more likely from industries asking for certain types of protection to help their interests at the expense of the larger interests. Now, today, we're in a new era in a sense, and I think one of the big problems we have in this country and in the world is that the financial crisis hit us really, really hard. We have not rebounded as rapidly and as robustly as we normally would in typical recessions in the past. And the U.S. economy is still, despite lower unemployment now, is still not as vibrant and as dynamic as it was prior to the financial crisis. So there's a lot of concern about job security, and I think that extends especially across America, and especially amongst groups who don't have college educations or master's degrees and whatnot. And that's having a very big effect in the U.S. of inspiring this retrenchment towards increased protectionism, increased calls for reduction in trade. I think it's based on a misunderstanding. It's a misunderstanding of the larger picture, but it's not a misunderstanding of their own effects and their own impacts. Protection can help certain individuals and certain workers in certain industries. But if we provide that protection to those groups directly by cutting off trade, we're going to be creating a larger harm to the rest of the country by virtue of that. So the response would be, and my suggestion would be, that we need to focus more attention on the transitions of workers out of industries that are being affected by import competition and make more job security in the transition. So don't try to keep them in their jobs, but try to make sure that there's plenty of opportunities and places to go if you lose your job because of import competition. Yeah.
Okay. So what you're talking about there is basically going back to the idea that as long as there are no boundaries to workers changing, there's no boundaries to
between industries.
Between industries, that's where we get our optimal economy.
We get that, yeah.
Right.
We've got to be able to move workers from one industry to another. Now that's based a lot on transition of skills and being able to adapt and to learn new things and being flexible enough to make those adjustments. Some workers can do that easily. The more education you've had and the more kind of different ideas you've been exposed to, the more likely you can adjust. The less education you've had, the less likely that's possible. And that makes it really difficult for workers at lower skill levels. Yeah.
We don't opt for the transition approach, and we do put up these protective barriers. Will there come a point where the greater society will be hurt enough that they'll rebel against that and get into more opinions? But you talked about earlier the subsidy effects, like they were kind of marginal or not noticeable for a vast majority.
Yeah, I mean, it can be big enough, and that's kind of what happened in the Great Depression. We put really high levels of protection. Trade dried up significantly during the 1930s. And then there was a kind of a retrenchment after that, where it's like, well, this doesn't get us any good, and things are much, much worse. How do we stimulate economic activity? Trade is a way to do that. And so the beginning of trade liberalization in the post-World War II period really began in the depths of the Great Depression, when we had kind of closed our economies up so much in the world that there was no place to go but open. And yes, we could end up, but the problem is how close do we have to get, and how bad does it have to get before we finally get to that, to that retrenchment? And we've spent, literally 60 to 70 years whittling down the barriers to trade. We don't have anywhere close to free trade in this world, but we've got much more liberal trade today than was existed back 50 years ago. And it has taken a very long time and a lot of effort to get to the position that the world is in today. And that could be lost very, very quickly.